This channel examines the Jeffrey Epstein case using court documents, public records, and verified reporting. We do not speculate. We do not accuse. We document what exists, and what remains unanswered. Everything presented here is drawn from publicly available sources. This is not a theory channel. This is the file. When people talk about Jeffrey Epstein's private jet, they rarely start with documents. They start with rumors. But flight logs are not rumors. They are records. Dates, times, passenger names, departure cities, destinations. And in the Epstein case, those records became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the public sphere. Epstein owned and used multiple aircraft over the years, including a Boeing 727 that media outlets later labeled the Lolita Express. The nickname dominated headlines. It shaped perception before many people ever saw a single document. But labels are not evidence. Flight logs, by contrast, are technical documents. They are created by pilots and crew members. They record scheduled movements and, in many cases, the names of passengers as provided to flight staff. After Epstein's legal troubles resurfaced in 2019, portions of these flight logs entered the public record through court filings and investigative reporting. Some were previously introduced during civil litigation. Others were unsealed during later proceedings. Once released, they triggered intense public reaction. Why? Because names appeared. Prominent figures, politicians, business leaders, academics, celebrities. The presence of recognizable names in aviation logs immediately fueled speculation. But the central question is not whether names appear. The central question is, what do flight logs actually prove? A name on a flight manifest confirms one thing with certainty, that an individual was recorded as a passenger on a specific aircraft on a specific date. It does not automatically confirm the purpose of the trip, knowledge of criminal activity, participation in wrongdoing, awareness of other passengers, what occurred at the destination. This distinction is critical. Flight logs are logistical records, not narrative documents. They do not describe conversations, activities, or intent. They do not establish context beyond movement. Yet in the Epstein case, context is everything. Some flights traveled between major cities like New York, Palm Beach, Washington, and international destinations. Others reportedly included trips to Epstein's private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The mere mention of the island intensified speculation, regardless of what the documents explicitly showed. And this is where confusion begins. Because public discourse often collapses two separate ideas: presence and participation. The logs show presence. They do not, by themselves, show participation in criminal conduct. Flight logs did not surface all at once. They entered the public record in fragments. Some were introduced during civil lawsuits filed by survivors. Others were referenced in depositions. Additional pages were unsealed during later federal proceedings. Journalists obtained copies through court filings and investigative reporting. This gradual release created confusion. There was no single official archive labeled Epstein flight logs. Instead, documents appeared in batches: photocopies of handwritten pilot notes, typed manifests, redacted pages, partially legible entries. Authenticity matters in cases like this. The logs most frequently cited were attributed to pilots who worked for Epstein. Their handwriting, signatures, and routine formatting patterns were used to verify consistency across documents. In court settings, such records are typically authenticated through testimony or chain of custody procedures. But outside courtrooms, nuance often disappears. Once uploaded online, the logs took on a second life. Spreadsheets were created. Names were highlighted. Screenshots circulated without context. In some cases, entries were misread. Handwritten initials were mistaken for full names. Similar surnames were conflated. Redactions fueled speculation. Social media accelerated interpretation. A single cropped image showing a recognizable name could travel faster than any accompanying explanation. Context, such as whether the flight was between two public cities or whether the passenger was part of a larger group, was often omitted. Another complication: not every log was complete. Aviation records can reflect who was scheduled, who boarded, or who was expected, and these categories are not always identical. Crew notation practices vary. Sometimes passengers are listed as guest or abbreviated. In other cases, names are missing entirely. Absence in a log does not necessarily mean absence from a flight. Presence in a log does not describe behavior. These limitations matter because once the documents entered the public sphere, they were no longer treated as logistical records. They became symbols. For some, they represented proof of hidden networks. For others, they were raw data requiring careful interpretation. The gap between those two approaches widened over time. Once you move past the headlines and actually examine the flight logs, a few consistent patterns emerge. First, repetition. The aircraft frequently traveled between a predictable set of locations: New York, Palm Beach, Washington, D.C., New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. These were not random global routes. They reflected Epstein's known residences and social hubs. Second, clustering. Certain names appear multiple times across different dates. Not hundreds of times, not constantly, but recurrently. This suggests ongoing association, at least at the level of travel. However, repetition alone does not establish wrongdoing. Frequent travel between major cities, particularly New York and Palm Beach, is common among wealthy individuals with multiple homes. Washington flights may indicate meetings, events, or professional engagements. Without contextual documentation, the logs only confirm movement. Third, group travel. Many flights list multiple passengers, sometimes large groups. This complicates interpretation. A flight that included several guests does not automatically imply intimate association among all passengers. People attend conferences, philanthropic gatherings, fundraisers, and social events. Being on the same aircraft does not mean shared purpose. Fourth, incomplete entries. Some logs contain initials rather than full names. Others list guest or partial identifiers. There are instances where handwriting is unclear. Online interpretations have occasionally assigned names based on guesswork rather than verification. This is where analytical discipline becomes crucial. A flight log is strongest when it provides a full name, a clear date, a documented destination. Even then, it proves only transport. It does not prove knowledge of abuse, presence during criminal acts, participation in illegal activity, awareness of other passengers' actions. The public often wants flight logs to function as maps of conspiracy. But they are closer to travel receipts. One additional pattern is geographic. The U.S. Virgin Islands destination drew particular attention because Epstein owned property there. Flights to that location are frequently highlighted in public discourse. Yet even here, context matters. The logs do not describe who was present on the island at the same time, what occurred during the visit, or how long passengers stayed. Movement is not motive. Travel is not testimony. Once the logs became public, attention shifted quickly from routes to names. And names carry weight. Public figures, politicians, academics, business leaders, celebrities, began appearing in screenshots shared across news sites and social media platforms. In many cases, the presentation was simple: a highlighted name next to a destination. But presentation shapes perception. A list without context can imply a story that the document itself does not tell. Some individuals listed in the logs had acknowledged social or professional relationships with Epstein. Others stated they had limited contact, perhaps attending a dinner, meeting, or event. A few publicly denied knowing him well at all. The flight logs, however, do not measure the depth of a relationship. They record presence on a flight. Nothing more. Another critical issue was time. Many flights occurred years before criminal charges became widely known. Public understanding of Epstein evolved over time, particularly after his 2008 plea agreement and later federal arrest in 2019. A flight taken in the 1990s carries a different context than one taken after public allegations were widely reported. Yet online discussions rarely differentiate by era. All entries are often treated as equally suspicious, regardless of when they occurred. There were also instances of mistaken identification. Handwritten initials were interpreted as belonging to high-profile individuals without definitive confirmation. Similar surnames were assumed to refer to famous figures when they may not have. In fast-moving digital spaces, corrections rarely spread as quickly as accusations. This dynamic created a secondary controversy. Not just who flew, but what flying meant. For some observers, inclusion in the logs became synonymous with guilt by association. For others, the logs were evidence of proximity to power rather than proof of wrongdoing. Legal systems operate on evidence of action. Public discourse often operates on inference. That gap widened as the documents circulated. It is also important to note, being listed in a flight log does not automatically mean the person was aware of illegal conduct, nor does it indicate they witnessed or participated in criminal activity. Determining those facts requires independent investigation, testimony, and corroborating evidence, not transportation records alone. The logs raised questions. They did not answer all of them. In courtrooms, documents are not symbols. They are evidence, but only within strict limits. When flight logs appeared in legal proceedings connected to Jeffrey Epstein, they were not introduced as proof of a global conspiracy. They were used for something far narrower, establishing timelines, corroborating travel, and confirming associations between individuals at specific points in time. That distinction matters. A flight log can help demonstrate that a defendant was in a certain city on a certain date. Two individuals traveled together. A trip occurred that aligns with other testimony. But it cannot, by itself, prove what happened after landing. Who met privately? Whether a crime occurred? Who knew what? In civil litigation brought by survivors, the logs were often referenced to support claims about movement between properties. If a witness testified that a trip took place, the log could strengthen or challenge that statement. In criminal proceedings, prosecutors typically rely on a combination of witness testimony, physical evidence, financial records, communication records, travel documentation. The logs were one piece, not the foundation. Another important point: courts require authentication. Before such documents are admitted, attorneys must establish their origin. That can involve pilot testimony, company records, or chain of custody verification. A document circulating online does not automatically meet evidentiary standards. This is where public interpretation often diverges from legal reality. Outside the courtroom, flight logs were sometimes treated as definitive proof of hidden knowledge. Inside the courtroom, they were treated as logistical records, relevant but limited. Even in high-profile cases, judges instruct juries carefully. Association alone is not guilt. Transportation alone is not participation. Presence alone is not proof. That legal principle does not eliminate moral questions or public concern, but it defines how evidence must function under law. And that brings us to a deeper issue. If flight logs do not prove criminal conduct, why did they capture so much attention? The flight logs became powerful not because of what they proved, but because of what people believed they might reveal. At the center of the Epstein case was a disturbing question. How could alleged abuse persist for years around powerful, connected individuals? The logs appeared to offer a tangible thread. They were concrete, handwritten, dated. In a case filled with sealed records, redactions, and unanswered questions, the logs felt like something solid, something people could examine themselves. And in the digital age, access changes perception. When documents circulate publicly, people do not wait for court conclusions. They analyze, annotate, and publish interpretations in real time. Online communities created searchable databases. Names were sorted alphabetically. Flight counts were tallied. Patterns were proposed. The logs became interactive evidence. But there is a psychological factor at play here. Humans are pattern-seeking by nature. When we see repetition, a name appearing multiple times, our minds instinctively assign significance. We assume frequency implies deeper involvement. Sometimes that instinct is correct. Sometimes it is not. Another reason the logs resonated: symbolism. Epstein's private jet acquired a nickname in media culture, often referred to as the Lolita Express. That label, widely repeated, intensified public perception. The aircraft itself became shorthand for secrecy and privilege. A jet suggests exclusivity, invitation-only access, closed doors at 30,000 feet. Even without evidence of misconduct aboard the aircraft, the imagery alone carried emotional weight. There was also distrust in institutions. By the time the logs gained widespread attention, Many members of the public believed that powerful individuals had escaped accountability. The logs appeared to represent a list, perhaps even a ledger, of those connected to that world. Whether or not that interpretation was legally accurate, it resonated emotionally. And emotion drives attention. It is important to separate two realities. The logs document travel. The case involves confirmed criminal conduct by Epstein. The emotional bridge between those two facts is where speculation often forms. Understanding that bridge is essential. Because once a document becomes symbolic, its factual limitations can fade from view. By this point, it's important to shift focus. Not to what the flight logs contain, but to what they don't. First misconception. The logs are a complete passenger list of everyone who ever traveled with Epstein. They are not. The publicly circulated logs represent records from specific aircraft and specific time periods. They do not necessarily include every flight ever taken, every aircraft used, every charter arrangement, every passenger on every trip. Absence from the logs is not proof someone never traveled. Presence in the logs is not proof of broader involvement. Second misconception. The logs prove criminal participation. They don't. They confirm transportation, nothing more. They do not describe conversations, meetings, or events that occurred before departure or after landing. They do not record behavior. They do not assign knowledge or intent. Legal responsibility requires evidence of action. The logs do not provide that by themselves. Third misconception. Every person listed knew about criminal conduct. There is no automatic evidence of that. Epstein moved in elite social and professional circles for years before his conduct became widely exposed. Many individuals interacted with him in business, philanthropic, academic, or political contexts. The logs cannot determine what any passenger knew, or did not know, at the time. Fourth misconception. All flights to certain destinations imply misconduct. Destinations such as New York, Palm Beach, Washington, D.C., and the U.S. Virgin Islands appear repeatedly. But these were locations tied to known residences and properties. Travel to a location does not specify activities within that location. The logs do not map behavior. They map routes. Another overlooked detail. Handwritten aviation logs are administrative tools. Pilots record passengers for operational and regulatory reasons. The formatting is functional, not investigative. Errors, abbreviations, and shorthand are common in such documents. Treating them as comprehensive investigative reports misrepresents their purpose. None of this minimizes the seriousness of Epstein's crimes. It clarifies the evidentiary boundaries of one specific document set. There is a difference between proximity and participation, between association and action, between suspicion and proof. Understanding that difference is essential in high-profile cases, especially when public trust is already strained. Once the flight logs entered public circulation, media coverage intensified. But media operates under different pressures than courts. Speed matters. Attention matters. Clarity matters. Nuance often does not travel as well. Headlines began emphasizing recognizable names. Articles highlighted specific flights to high-profile destinations. In some cases, coverage carefully explained that being listed in a log did not imply wrongdoing. In other cases, the distinction was less prominent. A headline might read, "Prominent figure appears in Epstein flight logs." Technically accurate, but incomplete. The article might later clarify that the flight occurred years before criminal allegations became public, or that multiple passengers were aboard, or that the trip was between major metropolitan cities for a known event. However, many readers do not move beyond the headline. Social media amplified this dynamic. Clipped screenshots circulated without dates. Partial images of handwritten entries were shared without context. Commentary layered on top of the documents, sometimes responsibly, sometimes speculatively. Another factor. The narrative vacuum. The Epstein case contains unresolved questions, sealed materials, and unfinished threads. When information is incomplete, speculation often fills the space. Flight logs became a visible, accessible artifact in a case otherwise marked by redaction. That visibility made them central to public conversation. There is also the issue of algorithmic amplification. Content suggesting scandal spreads faster than content emphasizing evidentiary restraint. Assertions travel farther than caveats. A list of names generates more engagement than a detailed explanation of what a travel record can and cannot prove. This does not mean media coverage was uniformly irresponsible. Investigative journalists played a critical role in bringing Epstein's conduct to light. Reporting exposed failures in oversight, prosecutorial decisions, and institutional blind spots. But once the logs became part of the story, they sometimes evolved into something larger than their evidentiary function. A document meant to record flights became interpreted as a map of complicity. The distinction between reporting facts and implying conclusions blurred in some public discussions. Understanding this shift is crucial, because it shapes how the public evaluates accountability, and how reputations are affected. As public attention intensified, a central question emerged. Did official investigations treat the flight logs as a roadmap to a broader network? The answer is more complex than many assume. When federal authorities charged Jeffrey Epstein in 2019, the indictment focused on specific alleged conduct, specific victims, and specific timeframes. Prosecutors typically build cases around directly provable offenses, supported by witness testimony, digital evidence, financial records, and corroboration. Flight logs can assist in timeline verification, but they are not investigative endpoints. Law enforcement does not treat a passenger manifest as automatic evidence of criminal conspiracy. Instead, investigators look for communications between individuals, financial transactions, testimony from witnesses, documentary evidence linking actions to intent. If a person's name appears in a log, investigators would need additional evidence to determine whether further inquiry is warranted. Another layer complicates the picture. Association is not inherently criminal. High-profile individuals often attend events with hundreds of guests. They travel in overlapping social circles. They board private aircraft for conferences, fundraisers, or business meetings. A name appearing in a log might prompt questions, but questions are not charges. It's also important to remember timing. By 2019, much of the publicly circulated flight log material related to years, sometimes decades, prior. Investigations prioritize actionable evidence within legal time constraints and jurisdictional boundaries. There is no public record indicating that flight logs alone resulted in broad waves of criminal charges against passengers. Instead, investigative focus centered on Epstein's own conduct and, separately, on associates directly alleged to have participated in criminal acts. This distinction frustrated some observers. For those who viewed the logs as proof of a hidden system, the absence of sweeping indictments appeared suspicious. For prosecutors, however, evidentiary standards remain fixed, regardless of public pressure. Suspicion can motivate inquiry, but prosecution requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That threshold does not change because a case is high profile. After reviewing the flight logs, a clear conclusion emerges. The documents are important, but only within their limits. They record movement. They confirm presence. They provide context for other evidence. But they do not automatically prove intent, knowledge, or participation in criminal activity. What the logs do reveal, however, is the intersection of wealth, access, and perception. Jeffrey Epstein moved in elite circles. His travel patterns reflected multiple residences, frequent business hubs, and high-profile social networks. The logs document those patterns. They show who traveled where, and when. They highlight recurring associations. Yet raw data alone cannot tell the full story. Context is essential. Media coverage, public speculation, and viral dissemination often blur the line between presence and implication. Headlines transform records into symbols. Social media amplifies assumptions. Human pattern seeking drives conclusions that go beyond the documents themselves. From a legal perspective, flight logs are a tool, not a verdict. From a societal perspective, they became evidence in the court of public opinion. And that duality is instructive. The Epstein flight logs teach us: evidence must be interpreted cautiously. Presence is not proof. Access and association do not equal culpability. Public perception can shape narrative faster than courts. Transparency and documentation matter, but interpretation matters more. In the end, the logs are a reminder of a broader truth about the Epstein case. Powerful systems, wealth, and secrecy intersect in ways that complicate accountability. Documents are one piece of the puzzle, but understanding context, limits, and legal boundaries is essential for a fair and accurate evaluation. These lessons extend beyond Epstein. They illuminate how society processes information about the powerful, and why critical thinking is necessary when raw data enters the public sphere. The documents exist. The questions remain. This channel will continue examining what is public, and what is still hidden. If you value documented analysis over speculation, consider subscribing. More files coming.